accident that white people do not enjoy seeing ordinary black people's lives. It is no accident that in most of the TV series that the black characters are still, and this is the insistence, are still caricatures. The notion of ordinary existence is denied. I'll give you a very good example. Some of you have seen Losing Ground. When Losing Ground was first shown in a theater for distributors, after the film was screened, as you know, it's just basically about a husband and wife. The husband is an artist and the wife is a philosophy teacher. And basically what happens is you see them go through a trauma in their marriage and you see them try and resolve it. It's really not any more complicated than that as a movie. When white distributors saw that movie, they came up to, not me, they didn't dare come up to me, but they came up to the people who were working for us and trying to get us distribution. They said, we don't know any black people like that. We don't know any black women like that. And this is amazing because where's the racial angle here? I posit that it has so many racial angles. But what it starts from, the premise of the movie, and I take this back to this experience of love, the premise of the movie is that no one ultimately is going to mythologize my life. No one is going to refuse me the right to explore my experiences of life as normal experiences, neither outside nor inside, human experiences. And that the humanism of that experience is, I posit, the last hurdle we have to transcend.
That's Kathleen Collins, Director of Losing Ground at Howard University, 1984. Hello, and welcome to Black is Not a Genre, a film podcast where we explore new perspectives on black genre cinema and discuss alternative narratives in genre film through a black lens. My name is Graham Cumberbatch, and this is episode 6. It is also the talkback for the week 6 of the second month of our virtual film series hosted by Hyperreal Film Club out of Austin, Texas. All August, we invite viewers and listeners to watch along with us as we focus on a different black film in a different genre of cinema each week and discuss the films and its makers' contributions to the form. At the end of each week, we'll be airing a new episode of the Black is Not a Genre podcast featuring a revolving lineup of special guests. This week, we'll be discussing magical realism in a doubleheader of cinematic gems including 1982's black intellectual relationship dramedy Losing Ground by Kathleen Collins and Kasi Lemmons' 1997 Southern Gothic classic Bayou. Before I introduce this week's guest, I want to give a special thank you to Hyperreal Film Club for hosting us as part of their summer programming. In addition to presenting an eclectic mix of the world's greatest movies, Hyperreal Film Club seeks to build a special community around the moving image. They specialize in creating unique movie-watching experiences in unusual, thoughtful, and immersive pop-up environments. Hyperreal also amplify local artists by screening the pieces they've already produced, as well as creating paid opportunities for them to create and exhibit new work. They're always looking for collaborators, so whether you have a short film or music video you'd like to premiere, or you're just looking to connect with other local filmmakers, hit them up. This week our guest is distinguished filmmaker and film professor Madeleine Hunt Ehrlich. Madeline is the writer and director of feature film Madame Négritude. Her work is screened all over the world, including at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and in film festivals such as Doclisboa, True False, Images Film Festival, New Orleans Film Festival, and Blackstar Film Festival. She's been featured in Essence Magazine, Studio Museum Studio Magazine, ARC Magazine, Bomb Magazine, Guernica Magazine, and Small X Journal, among others. She is the recipient of a 2020 SF Film Rainin Grant, a 2019 Rema Hort Mann Award, a 2019 Undue Fellowship and Grant from Uniondocs Just Films, a 2015 TFI Future Filmmaker Award, and the 2014 Princess Grace Award in Film. Her work has been recognized by the Time Inc. Black Girl Magic Emerging Director Series, the National Magazine ELLIE Awards, and she has received grants from the National Black Programming Consortium and Glassbreaker Films. Madeline has a degree in film and photography from Hampshire College and has an MFA in film and media arts from Temple University. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Black is Not a Genre. We're joined today by award-winning filmmaker and professor Madeleine Hunt Ehrlich. Thank you for joining us today. So this week we're talking about magical realism, which is kind of a little bit tricky because we're dealing with film, and it's coming from a more of a literary conceit, but I think there's a lot of really vivid areas in which to speak about in film, and we're covering Kathleen Collins' Losing Ground, 1983, and the second part of our double feature is Kasi Lemmons' Eve's Bayou, 1997. You just start with, I'd love to start with Kathleen. What was your introduction to Kathleen Collins' work?
Yeah, so I think I first saw the film in a theater, obviously after its re-release. And I think before I even saw Losing Ground, though, I read the release of her short stories, What Happened to Interracial Love.
Right.
And for me, I was also really compelled by the kind of meta-narrative of her career and the kind of rescue of her career by her daughter, and also, in collaboration with an audience and curators and a public that was really ready finally for Black women authorship, right, in a way that they were not when the film first came out. So there's this funny piece of Losing Ground, I think, in that it's a film that was made in 1982 or 83, but in some ways it's a contemporary film because its release and its wider release really didn't kind of enter the body public in the way it has until 2015. Right. So in some ways there's funny, right? Like it's a contemporary film.
It is. I think that's really, like, the temporality of that is really key. It's like a good thing to pick up on, I think, because there's this way in which her work was ahead of its time, but also not, where it's like it was very much of the moment. It's just that the people who had the power in terms of who got to see it and who didn't decided they weren't ready. So there's this sense in which she's dealing with something evergreen, but like she has this, like you said, she has this way, and it's a testament to how important and enduring her work is, where it feels of the moment, even 20 some odd years after it was made and after she passed away. So I think one of the central elements of it is she's dealing with something, with a subject matter and a sort of she's dealing with Black characters that had never really been seen on screen. She's dealing with sort of this Black intelligentsia, the central characters. It's a relationship between an artist, a painter, and a philosophy professor. And you can kind of see the roots of where one of the other documents I was watching in tandem with this is this sort of filmmaking, screenwriting masterclass lecture she gave at Howard in 1984.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where you watch, it's like, it's so brilliant. Like it's only 2 hours long, but like it takes you so much longer because it's like, okay, this is something I need to mark and write down. It's like the nuggets are just incessant, and you get a sense of why she decided to make films, because she talks about in interviews she was never really a film person growing up. She was more of a reader, and she sort of got into it because she got really attracted when she was a part of the Middlebury program at the Sorbonne, And so when she started studying film, and she really got attached to it when she started studying literary adaptations. And so like her first film, The Cruz Brothers and Miss Malloy, was an adaptation of Henry Roth's story. I think that's his first name. And so you kind of get a sense of her roots, but she really kind of, in the lecture, she starts from the beginning. She talks about how Jean-Paul Sartre and Janae Saint Sinner, which at the opening scene in Losing Ground, she's giving a lecture on Sartre, and so there's the connections are already there. And she talks about how the Black figure as the sort of forced outsider and the projected center of American society, and so having in making films from that perspective, you're fighting against this sort of constant dehumanization, where it's like you have to, in order to get your story on screen, a lot of times you have to mythologize the Black experience, where you're either super good or super evil. And she talks about how her film is a rejection of that notion, where it's the humanity that people connect with. It's the psyche that attracts the people. And so she talks about how she refuses to mythologize her experience, and she only deals with real characters that she connects with, and how in a lot of ways that was the problem with getting the film distributed. She talks about how film distributors, when they first screened it, said, oh, and we hear, it's so funny because we hear this all the time, and I'm sure you've heard it too. It's like, oh, we don't know any Black people like that. We don't know these stories. And so there's this constant struggle here. But I think the film just sort of like plops you right down in the middle of that, the constant conversation around that, the conflict between the husband and the wife. Was there anything that you initially connected to, as far as the centering of Black artists in a relationship? Was that something that you had seen on film before?
Yeah, I think, well, I really love that kind of echo between the fact that the two Kathleen Collins films that are most widely available are Losing Ground and her lecture at Howard, right?
Yeah.
And how that first scene, like you said, kind of overlaps with her lecture itself, and really speaks to how the film has so many elements of memoir in it.
Yeah.
Which I think so does Kasi Lemmons' Bayou.
Absolutely.
So that's something that's interesting. And then they're both also, they're both taking on the Black upper middle class, right? So that's another way that like those films have, some, besides being a part of, I think many people do think of them as like a part of a similar canon or timeline.
Right.
There's also that. And, I'm certainly a person who has felt that, as a filmmaker, there is both a need for more stories about Black life that don't just focus on Black victimhood, as well as a need to complicate a Black respectability politic, right? And I think that Kathleen Collins does that, right? I mean, and she talks about that too, right? In that lecture about like, I just remember her talking about like, in that dichotomy, she's mentioning like the need for rich characters where, Black people aren't all bad and they're not all good, but they're, human, which includes both being good and bad. And often I think in a Black upper middle class respectability but kind of project, if you will, right? So like just how people like represent themselves socially or perform socially, but also how stories are then told about that group of people. There's a real kind of focus on like a, maybe like a Raisin in the Sun kind of like, kind of long-suffering Black upper, Black middle class family who's just like trying to do good and like society is like this source of kind of an obstacle and an evil.
Right.
But in reality, right, like, you know, Black upper middle class people do fucked up things to each other, to themselves, to, you know, like, or they're just people.
Mhm.
And you really feel that in Losing Ground, right, where we're there's no white character in the film. There's no white character named Bayou either. I
Mm-mm.
guess there's like a white Latin next man in Losing Ground, but
Right,
there's
his
really,
mentor.
yeah, and there's like some light skin Latinx folks, but there you don't get a sense of like kind of like the outer kind of white world.
Right.
But we're also not overly debating like Black people's relationship to white people.
Exactly.
Very we're very in the interpersonal ways that a wife and a husband, two you know, an artist and a thinker, two people who are desiring freedom and struggling to experience freedom in these different ways and struggling against each other. We're just very located in that dynamic, you know?
Yeah, and I think, when you mentioned the fact there are no white people in it, one of the things she talks about, one of the direct quotes she said from, the distributors who didn't see how this could make it a screen. She said, they asked, like, where's the racial angle? And to me, it's like whenever you hear sort of white producers say that, it just means it's like, where am I in it? I don't see myself. And I only recognize you in relation to my perspective as a white person. And so in refusing to center that, she contributes to this fuller story, but she's also, paid a price while she was alive in terms of her film's distribution. And like what you're talking about with the sort of, the Raisin in the Sun reference, it's funny. There was one of my favorite conversations in the film is the first one that they have with Sarah, the main character's mother, who's an older stage actress. And she talks about a play that she's in, and she says, oh, I'm play like a mother who's like really godly. And so she kind of skewers this like strong Black woman figure. And she calls the play, oh, it's thoroughly colored, which is just like such a great line. And she, it's a direct reference to what Kathleen Collins talks about in her lecture is, this tendency to mythologize Black history, where we talk about it in these very staid, white-facing terms of, this is the Black hero, this is what he represents in terms of the progress of the race, and she skewers that in a sense where it's like, it's not true, it's not human, it's not real. There's no point in telling those stories, because, and not even in the sense of like her personal artistry, but she even kind of frames it in the sense of, how, quote, progress for Black art. She said, actually, the only way things change is if humans are allowed to connect to other human stories. And that's the only way to sort of combat this sort of dehumanization of Black stories, where we're either, there's a reason why Black Panther is like the biggest Black movie of all time. And I mean, there's multiple reasons, but like the symbology of that, of like being, of course, like the most successful Black story of all time is about a superhero. So I think there's a really nice element of that there. And you were talking about with Kasi Lemmons. I mean, I think what's interesting about that in terms of, the element of magical realism is, thinking about Kathleen Collins' sort of refusal to work with mythology, versus the way in which sort of mystical elements, whether through craft or through, more so in Eve's Bayou, through thematically, they're sort of infused in the way of storytelling in this way that sort of treats them the same as all the other, quote, sort of realist elements, which I think is really interesting, where it's like the dichotomy between a refusal to mythologize and an acceptance of the supernatural as just a natural, sort of progression or natural way of finding out who we are in the world that belongs intertwined in storytelling, but has like been very stubbornly like separated by the white filmmaking or Western filmmaking practices. And you see that a lot, more subtly in Losing Ground, but like more overtly in Kasi Lemmons' story. And speaking about Eve's Bayou, was there anything that you felt? Well, first of all, is that a film that has sort of inspired you in your own work in that sense?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think both filmmakers have inspired me differently, and I really loved that you paired these two films, because I don't know if I would have immediately thought of them together. And it was interesting to think of them and kind of like revisit parts of them in conversation, because there are these over, like, I want to say that they're a part of these different formal traditions, but then there are these formal choices they're both making that really are so similar, like the ways that both films use the like scene blocking basically as a thread of the story,
right,
where you have the characters sort of acting as directors or participants in the scene, and we have almost like, we break the fourth wall almost within the films themselves in both of them, right? And that's like my favorite part of Eve's Bayou, are those moments where they step into the memory and Debbie Morgan's like, and I was like, she like is like narrating the memory for you, and it's like
inside of it.
She's there inside of it. They're in the mirror. It's like a stage blocking. I love that. That is like thrilling to me. And of course, the final scene of Losing Ground, where we keep going back to like, we're making a film within a film. And within that process, the main character is able to have some kind of agency over, the little revenge fantasy, pointing the gun at her kind of flirtatious husband there. So they're both using that device of scene work throughout their films. That said, I do feel like they are operating also in these different traditions and contexts, and it might just be like an LA versus New York, division there, where I think like Eve's Bayou almost feels like you could like draw a lot of direct threads from like early race films or like studio films. It's like a 3-location, feels very kind of studio based, which I like, like high levels of artifice, and even like the dialogue, like really in every level, we're working in a way that like feels very connected almost to musicals, or like like Oscar Michaud or theater. And Losing Ground feels like a New York film with like much more kind of on location shooting. I love the fact a friend, a film scholar, Nzinga Kendall, informed me that Kathleen Collins was one of the English language translators for Cahiers du Cinéma, the French film journal. So she was one of the people who translated many of those issues into English. And so I think of, and like, she's friends with Bill Gunn, and who's in the film, who himself was an independent film director and playwright based in New York. And so and it just feels very much like a New York film that's like a little looser too. Like, I mean, there's also really just different budgets for those films.
Oh, for sure.
One thing that I enjoyed doing was, when I was like thinking about this conversation, I like kind of I was like looking at budgets, because I feel like that's an important way of understanding films too, and kind of like the ethics of the film too. Absolutely. It's both like understanding like the industry and the context of the film and the filmmaker, but it's also like it can be an ethical position as well, or like so like Losing Ground, the number I found was $125K. Eve's Bayou is 3 million.
Yeah.
And to give some perspective, I have some others. She's Gotta Have It, which I feel like owes a lot to Losing Ground.
Yeah,
Comes
absolutely.
out in 1986, is 175K. Daughters of the Dust, 1991, is 800K.
Okay.
And then I also thought about Sugarcane Alley, Yuzon Palcy's film, which is 1983, less than $1 million. So just to like give like a little sense, I mean, Eve's Bayou is by far the biggest budget there, and that like plays into how it feels different too,
Yeah.
right?
I think that's, it's spot on. Obviously, I think, and we've talked in previous episodes, but budgets are super. They're not. I think they are, like you said, that's a great way of phrasing it. They deal with the ethics of the film. It's like the energy of the film, the ethos of it, how they approach the storytelling has so much to do with, budget is really just another artistic or aesthetic constraint. So you deal with it in the same way you do other things. I think there's like a nice metaphor with like the film within a film of Losing Ground, where it's like there's, when we first see the director shooting the film, he's narrating a shot that Kathleen Collins is making, but it doubles as the shot of the film that he's making. And there's this metaphor there of just like, okay, two birds with one stone. There's just like this guerrilla filmmaking vibe where it's just like, listen, that we'll just knock out two things at once. And this sort of disembodied director that narrates those stories, the film within a film, is really great. And I actually, we're not, in these first few months of the series, we're not covering any Spike films, but obviously it comes up. And I had almost forgotten about She's Gotta Have It, and that there's the dance interlude, and that's like straight from Losing Ground.
Straight from it.
It's
yeah.
just like,
and feel about that. It's so intense when you realize that.
It's so intense. And it's funny because it's like, it's both like beautiful, and especially the way Spike uses it in terms of like, it's the only color segment in the film. But it's also like, it also feels a little bit, makes you feel a little some kind of way, like in terms of what film got made and distributed and what's famous. The fact that Kathleen Collins is a woman and Spike is not. So that, I think there's always, but again, we're getting at the grit of it in terms of Black artists and Black filmmakers. There are no heroes and villains, like people, there's a constant struggle within a struggle. So I think there's an element of that there too. But yeah, I mean, I think especially what you're talking about versus Eve's Bayou, which is more of a classic Hollywood approach. And you can kind of see the way even in terms of the casting, like Lynn Whitfield is like, she is just an old school. She has this sort of like, Liz Taylor type energy and beauty, and they use that in the film, and the setting of the film in the 60s and the costuming, there's a certain glamour to it. The casting of Diane Carroll obviously is just, there's so many references to like the glamour era of Hollywood, and even in the script in terms of how it's poetic nature. It's that, like, the opening credits and segment, it's one of the best in cinema, period, in terms of just the phrasing of it. It was, I was 10 years old when I killed my father. It's just, there's so like, there's no like opening lines colder than that, I think, in films. But I think in that sense, you're right. I think there are there's a distinction between their formal dimensions, and they're using different things to get at some of the same notions, where I think, Kathleen Collins, and even more so in the Cruz brothers, her first film, where the sort of mystical elements, and she talks about how there's a segment at that end of the film where because she collaborated with the original writer of the short story, Roth, and she added an entire scene at the end, which was like this magical ballroom scene, because she felt like it needed something symbolic. And throughout the film, it's three Puerto Rican brothers who get hired to help this older woman renovate her home before she dies. And one of the central conceits of it is the older brother can talk to their deceased father. And so in those scenes, in order to depict that, he just breaks the fourth wall and just looks and speaks directly to the camera. That's when you know he's talking to his father. And she does this thing. She reuses a lot of those techniques, but like more sparingly in Losing Ground, where she has this sort of sampled sound of wind, and she uses these disembodied voiceover in these segments, and then she goes handheld. And you know, a lot of she talks about how she was really attracted to like the realism of Breton, and I think there's a lot in there of like the Italian neorealism and some of the French New Wave. But whereas a lot of those films used handheld to sort of create the cinema verite, she almost uses it as this sort of like ghostly, like mystical element where it's the camera. There's certain scenes where it's handheld, and it feels more like there's this sort of like specter hovering over the character's shoulder, and like there's this she has so many references in the script to dreams, and so there's this like subtle dreamlike quality. I think that is really a nice foil to the more sort of classic Hollywood techniques that Kasi Lemmons is dealing with, the theme of like telling it, like you were talking about, the agency of the characters, not only to tell their own story apart from the director, but also particularly with the young girls, played by Journey Smollett and Megan Good, who are incredible, like some of the best like young acting you'll ever see. But their ability to sort of, you know, there's the opening scene where Journey sees her father cheating on her mom, and then when she tells her older sister, her sister goes back into the memory to sort of frame it differently, to correct it. And so there's this agency over how you remember things that's really powerful. I think one of the things that is really important about both of these being Black women filmmakers is, you know, this idea of legacy and like we were saying, sort of storytelling agency. I guess what are some elements of the films, and then again in your own work, as far as you know, crafting memory that sort of sticks out to you?
Yeah, I like a lot of what you were saying. I mean, I also was thinking about in terms of context as well, how both these films owe so much to the sort of 70s publishing renaissance of Black women's literature, like obviously Toni Morrison, but also like Gail Jones and Polly Marshall, and you know, they really like kind of pick up on that kind of literary spirit, I think, even in both of their approaches, right? Like there's a lot of dialogue in both films. And also in the kinds of female-driven storytelling that they're doing, it really feels like connected to that tradition in particular, like that moment of like that kind of breakthrough in literature and in publishing, where we could have like these really involved stories about family and, like you said, legacy and kind of inheritance through women, to like matriarchal lines of kind of you know, the trauma and the experiences that are being inherited. And yeah, it's interesting because I think now, like right now in our kind of contemporary moment, which is why in some ways Losing Ground is this way that you can also look at it as a contemporary film. I think we're in a moment that's like kind of post-internet, where we are just so saturated with images, right? There's like kind of like too much content, too many images, too many pieces of moving image, you know, work. And so as a result, I feel like a lot of practices, including my own, are kind of processing the archive. And the reason for that is kind of this like just kind of overabundance of things to comb through. We actually have, you know, more images than ever, and more access than ever before to images of ourselves from times when, you know, our stories couldn't be told through films.
Right.
Which is why like Losing Ground and kind of the rescuing that happens of that film and that print is like very contemporary.
Yes.
And so, you know, in my own practice, I have a similar interest in, like, that's partly why I find it to be one of the more exciting parts of Eve's Bayou and of Losing Ground, a similar interest in playing with form and thinking about form. For me, form is the point of view of the film. But I think there's also this way that, like, you know, now we're not just dealing with stories in the immediate, there's like a kind of collapsing of time, which I guess, you know, Kasi Lemmons was doing too. There's a collapsing of time that I think is very much about our context, you know, that we're responding to now. But it's interesting. I also wonder, like, with just thinking of Eve's Bayou for a minute, I really wonder about, like, how much Kasi was thinking about Daughters of the Dust or in conversation with it. And then, like, of course, thinking about, like, Lemonade, I wonder how much, you know, the very large team that worked on that, including Beyonce, we're thinking about Eve's Bayou, and I mean, obviously Daughters of the Dust, but like a kind of Southern Gothic tradition too. Yeah, like for me, I have to kind of like think of those films and like the images of those films. And I guess it's not fair to say that like filmmakers then weren't thinking about the archive as well, because, you know, Eve's Bayou, so much of the art direction does feel like someone was like studying all that like photography, like Southern family photography, you know, to like put together those amazing costumes, as you were saying.
No, I mean, I think there is a sense of that, like, you know, I think a lot of the most effective filmmakers are kind of, or not even just filmmakers, a lot of artists in general, it's like one of their approaches is through archiving, like obsessively archiving, particularly when it comes to, you know, costume designers. I mean, I think one of the sort of formal elements that stand out to me about both these films is the editing. And, you know, again, one of Kathleen Collins' gateways into filmmaking was editing. She got a job, I think it was like a national news station doing editing. And then the editor for Eve's Bayou, I'm going to mispronounce her name, Terrelyn Shropshire. She also edited Love and Basketball. And she, you know, she said she saw a lot of herself in the script, and her family. And then she credits Lemmons with kind of giving her the freedom to create her own rhythm of the story. And there's, like you said, the, you know, form as the point of view of the film. There's, you know, editors get so little credit sometimes, but I think it's also because there are multiple approaches to editing. You know, there's an editor who works at the service of the script, more so an editor who kind of articulates the vision of the director. And then there's an editor who adds an extra layer of art to the entire occasion. And I think Shropshire is one of those. I think Kathleen is someone who strikes me. You know, one of the other films we covered earlier was Born in Flames by Lizzie Borden. And she talks about how, you know, her filming process was so just guerrilla that she just got as much footage as she could and crafted most of the film in the editing room. And I think, you know, I haven't heard Kathleen talk about editing as much, but you get the sense that a lot of the way that she pieces together the film has a lot to do with the editing process and as another sort of formal layer to it, which I always find interesting, because I think there's a lot of, particularly when you're dealing, like you said, with these stories that deal with, you know, the agency of storytelling. And so there's this literal connection, particularly in Eve's Bayou, between the editing process and the re-editing of one's own memories and the re-remembering of certain things and agreeing the final scene between the two sisters. There's their bond is made over agreeing to remember something the same way, and like finding a consensus about the way that they think about something that happened, which is there's a strong sort of power in that. But I think there's where was I going with this? But I think in connecting the two films, it seems like there is definitely something there as far as like legacy and familial connection. Obviously, mother-daughter relationships are very strong, and there's a lot of good interviews.
But I would say that, you know, they're both really about female subjectivity, and as much as we have access to the men, you really feel like there's like an element of kind of the films themselves revise the experience of their protagonists, or maybe of their directors, where, you know, the women get the last word.
Yeah.
And there's like, when you're talking about editing, it feels like a very strong choice. You almost feel like those were endings found in the edit out of a politic to give the women the last word, whether it's the two girls after their father's death, or the protagonist in Losing Ground, you know, being able to kind of shoot a proxy for her husband in the scene. You know, in reality, in both of those stories, you know, the conflict probably lives on, right? It doesn't end there. But our moment where we leave the story is when these women have had their say. And that revisionism, I think, is actually really still very rare in film. Like, it's still really, I mean, the female gaze is like something that I think we're still figuring out. I get a little bothered by the opening scene in Eve's Bayou, where like the Sam Jackson like grabbing on Maddie Monroe, I forget the name of the actress, feels like such a male gaze shot, like such a textbook, just like, you know, Hollywood bro shot. And I don't blame her for using a vocabulary that is, you know, she's using a kind of Hollywood form, and she's repurposing it for and like creating a home for Black women in that form. But, you know, I think, you know, now for me, I take issue with like a shot like that. But I do think both of them are very concerned with female subjectivity. And I do think that is still a really radical position. Like, it just is. And they're just, you know, there are so many Black women directors now. And there always have been Black women involved in filmmaking. But that, you know, again, going back to budgets, that journey to raising the feature budget to then having the film properly distributed and preserved is still such a treacherous one for Black women, that we really don't have the breadth or body of historically examples, you know, that other folks have to say, okay, yeah, definitively, this is what happens when a Black female subject is the sole purpose, like the main purpose of a film, and what that representation is like. So
no, I mean, I think there's a mirroring of that. And when Kathleen is talking about, you know, white distributors who we don't know Black people like this, or who can't see themselves and therefore kind of deny it. And you get the same thing with you know, a male gaze that can't see himself in a film. So it becomes, and there's almost like a playfulness about it, because like there's male sort of this misogynist tendency to sort of just mystify everything that has to do with women. Like, oh, I don't understand it. It's weird. It's magic. And so there's this play on that where it's just like, well, yeah, you think it's magic, but like there also is an element that's magic about it, and it's not because we're so inscrutable, but it's just because there is an extra layer there that you probably won't understand. So that there is a sense in which it pokes at this male insecurity of like this, both this very real unknowability and this sort of like mythologized unknowability that works against women storytellers. And there's this
Right.
a lot of symbolic nature in that, and Eve's Bayou with, you know, Samuel L. Jackson's character and versus his sister, whereas like his sister is this sort of black mystic from a line of black mystics, and she's treated like she's crazy. She's sent to a mental institution, and where in the dichotomy between her and her brother, who is this heroic male black hero healer for the town, and there's sort of repetition of those dichotomies throughout the film.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or, you know, like for me, freedom is a really big theme of the film, whether it's the desire of the main little girl, Journey Smollet's character in Eve's Bayou, like, you know, and the kids to like get out of the house, and their kind of fear of like needing to keep them in the house, being in conflict, right, with like this desire to be like seen and like to run and to be free, versus Sam Jackson basically like as our kind of male character's ability to like come and leave as he come and go as he wants, and to kind of just follow whatever desire impulse he has, no matter who it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think that gets much more explicit in Losing Ground, where the central argument between them, like I love the in the pool scene where you know, the line is something like, you can just take out your dick.
Yeah.
I guess the issue is I don't have something to take out. Like I always remember that line. And then of course, you know, at the end she takes out a gun, right? And there's this way that it's also about, you know, really specifically grounded in the experience of women within like a class-based performance. And like that even I think gets to race too, right? Like in a respectability politic and like the restrictions of that politic, you know, for men and women, in terms of just the like how repressed folks have to be to kind of live up to some of the standards of that performance. And it feels like both these films sort of take that on, how repressive that actually is. And like the kind of female desire from a domestic point of view to experience the same kinds of freedoms that men feel really entitled to, of like, you know, satisfying an appetite or just, you know, being an individual. And, you know, like ecstasy is how Kathleen Collins puts it. But I think it also, you know, for me speaks to the failure of like, She's Gotta Have It, which just doesn't hold up. And like, of course, you know, Spike has kind of mea culpa that with his Netflix show, where he's like revisited like the big film that was like haunted him through all his many other successes, right? It was like the criticism of his female character and She's Gotta Have It. And so he like revisits it and tries to kind of flesh her out and like give her a little more of the feminism that like people wanted from She's Gotta Have It. But I think that Losing Ground and Eve's Bayou did it better. And it just really speaks to the need that like to have both, right? Like we need Black female storytellers because that understanding is not necessarily something that a male director can fake. You know, and I think that in She's Gotta Have It, I feel like the intention was probably from like a pretty like radical perspective about Black women and pleasure, but it kind of fails, right? And these women really, really get it and are able to do it in a nuanced way. And I think it, you know, it speaks to why we need more Black women able to tell feature-length stories.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, feature length is such a big deal too, because like you're talking about, space is so necessary. It's, you know, you need space to tell a story. That goes along with, you know, budget is space, length is space, breadth of catalog is space. I mean, you're talking about, you know, one of the things I've kind of in my own just like thoughts on film and just like hopefully in this series is kind of hammer on. It's just like the difference between, in a lot of sense, impact between Black filmmakers and some of the more notable white filmmakers is just the sheer number of films that they're allowed to make. That is, it's like for me, that's always the number one thing of like, how do you grow in your craft? Like if you're a painter, you can paint as many as you want all the time, but film is so collaborative and so dependent on outside resources that it becomes a huge barrier for entry. And I think, you know, as far as like the ecstasy of filmmaking, there's so much there, and it's so much that Black women filmmakers don't have access to.
Right. Yeah, failure is really important. Being able to fail is hugely important to the artistic process, to invention. And I think it's like one of the great things about Losing Ground is like what we were kind of describing as that sort of raw guerrilla or DIY aesthetic, is also a kind of like a kind of refusal of perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also why, you know, I feel like I'm very attracted to lower budget films, not, you know, in part from necessity, in part because that's the space where Black people where you can find the most Black filmmaking, because those are our resources. But also, those films are able to take different kinds of risks.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's so true. I mean, I think like Julie Dash, or Charles Burnett, the whole LA Rebellion generation who we owe so much to in our culture, really speaks to that robbery that happened, where just imagine if they had given Charles Burnett or Julie Dash, 10 more budgets, like what the conversation would be, because we owe them so much with what they had and what they could do in that time.
No, that's exactly it. I think there's definitely an element of, I don't want to say lost generation, but there's this element of, there's also this frustration of pairing that with what was happening simultaneously in mainstream cinema. It's like and I think a lot of why I wanted to do a series like this is, genre. I always say genre is really powerful, not only because it provides really important narrative constraints that allow for a sort of an almost, I want to say more universal, but there is a language that develops around genres. There's a legibility about genre that allows them to travel really far and allows them to be a good vehicle for ideas. And in strictly money terms, genre films make a lot of money. And so, we think about the 70s, the same era of the LA Rebellion is the same era that gave birth to just giants of white cinema, essentially, with the Coppola and Spielberg and Scorsese. And, there is a direct line in the sand between who America decided they wanted to hear from. And it's something that it's a deficit of recognition that I think Black filmmakers have been working to try and make up for a long time.
Right. And I would just add that I think that, the ways that I'm interested in talking about it now, and that I think, many other Black filmmakers are interested in thinking about it is, and Kathleen Collins, and I think Kasi Lemmons, all these filmmakers who've been talking about embody this. It's just finding ways to work around these systems and not putting everything on whether the door gets opened or not. And that includes, you know, the work of paying attention to a losing ground and making sure that it gets seen and written about, and paying attention to the works of, you know, short form filmmakers from that time, whether it's like Barbara McCullough or from the LA Rebellion, or Madeline Anderson, who's it's like the first Black female documentarian, who's really important too, and you know, countless others. Because sometimes, you know, if we're only canonizing based on features, we're gonna lose the thread of Black cinema.
Right.
And I think we have to just, yeah, we're gonna have. I think it's interesting to think about features and, you
Yeah.
know, like what else, like are features even really the way Black story that's really like decolonized should be told, you know? I think like the fact that you have like Lemonade having the cultural impact that it's had, or like Khalil Joseph, like short form pieces, like fleeting pieces, or like, you know, that there's, yeah, I think like you could really challenge if even, or the ways that like a Black cinematic tradition are not just shaped by features. So I think, yeah, like trying to change our systems of, kind of change our systems of approval, our systems of like how we're determining that tradition, is really important.
Yeah,
But
no, I think
yeah.
what you're that makes sense. And you know, we talked about like people, you know, feature having the freedom to do features, but also like you said, having the freedom to work in quote smaller formats where there's this there's this preference or this supremacy given to the feature length format as um, the ultimate measure of your quality as a filmmaker. And there's a reason for that, because it because it has a high barrier for entry. So it blocks out a lot of people. You know, and I have to give a shout out also to my cousin Storme Brightsweet, who was also part of the LA Rebellion, and she worked early on in video. I think her short film series, the Single Parent Images in Black, came out in 1982. And so, you know, she was working in a medium that wasn't even that popular then. It was kind of still burgeoning, but allowed for a lot of, due to cost and sort of mutability, allowed for a lot of sort of renegade filmmaking. And so it's like there are always like pioneers, and you know, you see it in every form of Black art. It's just like, you know, the reason hip hop is so important and the reason it travels so well globally is because you don't need anything. In a sense, it's like it's an art of repurposing. And so like you said, you know, your attraction to smaller budget filmmaking comes from the risk you're allowed to take when in a lot of ways you don't have as much to lose. So I think there's something really, really, really vital about that. But yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of, do you feel, I guess back on the genre a little bit, do you feel that there are sort of elements of magical realism that both conscious and unconscious that like creep into your own work?
Yeah, and I think that is because that is a Black tradition, right? That's like going back to different regional, like African traditions of storytelling, you know, that were really infused with spirituality and weren't necessarily premised on kind of Western narrative logics. I think that magical realism, or like that conception of storytelling, you know, overlaps with what is like inherently a way that Black people have told stories,
Right.
in our families,
Mm-hmm.
as well as just, you know, in literature and in art. so yeah, I think to that extent it's important. Another thing that I think of as, and this is not mine, this is to credit Mabel Haddock, who is a really important funder of Black films. She probably funded Daughters of the Dust and some of these other projects we've talked about. And she once said to me, and I always hold on to this, that Black film is always going to portray in some way, and I guess Losing Ground actually is you could argue is an exception to this, but she is always going to portray a community in some way, because like for Black people, it's not just a kind of cutthroat individualism. There's always a sense of community, right? Like the block, the family, the extended family, the neighbor, and you really can see that, and that kind of politic is really important to me, that like even if your film is trying to depict, like in the case of both these films, Black female interiority,
right,
and like the right to that space, that it also like holds the sense of connectedness between a community, and that's like an inherently Black way of making films. And maybe in Losing Ground, it's just the fact that like she's making the film in community with Bill Gunn and with Dwayne Jones, who was in Ganja and Hess as well. I mean, it's like clearly an artistic community in New York that she's a part of, that enables her to make the project she does for $125K, you know? But like that element is a really big distinction, I think, from the kind of typical like indie, like PWI, if you will, film perspective that's like very just about, you know, these individuals who have their goals and we're following that trajectory. I mean, like Black people really understand that we like rise and sink together. And that's in our storytelling.
No, I think you're exactly right. And, you know, there's that lecture at the Philly, I think it's like the Star Fest from several years ago. Blackstar, yeah, that's right. The talk back that Haile Gerima gave, and he talks about he talks about it in very clear terms. He's like the Black, if you're a Black filmmaker or storyteller, you have to have a certain amount of collectivity to the way that you tell stories, because that's not only is that, you know, the tradition you're working out of, but it's really the only way in a sense, and that we can sort of you know, elevate our art. And I think, you know, I think you're right about, you know, there is a tension between the collective and the individualistic in Losing Ground. And I think in some ways that's why it so easily lost a white audience, because as much as there's like almost a secret power in the way that we tell stories about community, there's also this element of like the Black family that white people expect to see, and it makes them uncomfortable when we see characters striving for individual freedom, and, you know, as Sarah talks about it, the sort of her like right to the ecstatic, but there's still a certain groundedness, and you see Sarah as you know, whenever she feels lost, she still goes to her mother. I think there's this sense in which she's depended on for her stability, not only by her husband, but her mother admits that she depends on her being the stable one also. And so we still see her centered in this, granted, like smaller enclave, but like you said, there's a sense of, even with the tension between her responsibility to whatever her community is, there's still a thread. And, you know, the stories take place, like you said, in these sort of Black enclaves that have found a way to carve out a certain, you know, agency that exists. There's a constellation that exists apart from this sort of white world, you know, whether it's geographically in Eve's Bayou, in terms of, you know, this piece of land that was passed down to them from Eve, or just sort of ideologically in Losing Ground, this community of black artists. But yeah, like you said, the connection there is really powerful. Before you go, do you have anything, do you want to plug anything you're working on?
Yeah. I have a short film called Spit on the Broom, set in the South, and it combines nonfiction footage with fiction collaboration with a number of actors to tell the story of the United Order of Tents, who are a secret order of Black women running from the South up to the Northeast, who were active founders of the Underground Railroad. So that short film is playing a bunch of places, including at Rooftop Cinema in New York, coming up on the 28th, and the Open City Film Festival in London in September. And then I also am developing a feature film, my first feature film, and writing a script about a writer named Suzanne Césaire, who in the way I put it, was one of the first people to articulate Black power, a kind of Black Pan-African power, ideology. She is from Martinique, and most of her writings from during World War II. She also was a surrealist, so the project should be a really exciting opportunity to kind of take some of the formal strategies of magical realism that we've been talking about and use them to revisit this woman's work and life. And so I hope you'll keep an eye out for that project as well.
Absolutely. I'm excited. I haven't been able to see Spit on the Broom, but I've read a lot about it, about the background, and it's amazing. So I'm going to try and catch that when I can. Any socials where people can find you to see what you're up to?
What are
you don't have to give them out either.
Maybe that can go in the podcast notes.
It'll go in the podcast.
I don't think I know off the top of my head.
That's probably a good thing, actually.
Google me.
A little distance is very important. Google her name, you'll find it. No problem.
Yeah.
But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. Take care. Good luck with all your future projects.